Welcome to this week's Concurrency Beer 30. I'm Nathan Lesnowski, Concurrency's Chief Technology Officer, and joining me this week is Keith Crosby. Keith is a technical architect in our identity practice. Welcome, Keith.
Hi.
What kind of beer are you drinking?
I am drinking a Scotch Ale from Hop House.
So that's a pretty dark beer you got there.
It is. That's my style, not an IPA.
Nice, nice. I am drinking a Stella cider, and it's publicized as not a beer, not a wine. And it's terrible. It is potentially the worst beer-ish thing I've ever had. But, you know, we'll just keep going with that. So,
Mine's good.
well, that makes one of us, so we're in good shape. So, Keith, you've had a long history working with identity.
Yep.
A lot of work with Microsoft Identity Manager.
Yep.
And you've been doing then a lot of migration and movement of companies into the cloud. I was hoping you might be able to give us a little bit of an understanding of where the market's been and a little bit of where the market's going. Maybe just kind of starting with historically, what is Microsoft Identity Manager, why were people using it, and what's happening with the market now?
Right, so traditional identity management is pulling data from an authoritative source like an HR system and then provisioning accounts, typically Active Directory, get the user mailbox, historical stuff on-prem, Skype, other applications, provisioning into other on-prem systems, and then more importantly, managing those accounts throughout the life cycle, so granting rights as the information like the HR system changes, as they change roles, and more importantly from a security perspective, when the account is terminated, right, shutting down all that access to everything else, ensuring everything else is cleaned up and that user can't get at anything else after their account's been shut off. So, I mean, historically, all those systems that we would connect to were on-prem systems. It was an on-prem HR system, it's Active Directory on-prem, and Exchange was on-prem, and other databases and other apps were all on-prem. So, Microsoft acquired a company a million years ago, and became MIS and ILM and then FIM and now MIM. But historically it's been primarily an on-prem identity management system. So, and then as applications start moving to the cloud, MIM still has a place because not everybody is 100% cloud yet. So there's still work for MIM to do on-prem, and it kind of complements what's going on with stuff with Azure AD Connect, right, and all that stuff. And Azure AD Connect is really, it's really MIM and FIM and everything else under the covers, but it's more of an appliance version of that. So it's just a natural extension that's bringing that stuff to the cloud.
Got it. So when you think about the extent to which it's on-premise synchronized to the cloud and then used to access cloud applications in some capacity versus cloud synchronized back down to the on-premise environment, kind of where are we in that picture right now?
Right, we're just sort of getting into that. So Microsoft has released what they're calling the Azure AD User Provisioning Service, unless they've renamed it recently, which is sort of that opposite side of things. So a connector from Azure to Workday was their first main HR system that they partnered with to pull in those identities and either create them directly in Azure AD or create them through an agent in on-prem AD. So Workday is the only one I think that's GA right now, it's GA right now. They are working on SuccessFactors, which I think is public preview right now. But those today are still fairly limited. It will create the account in your on-prem AD and not much else. So you can do a little bit of stuff around making sure they're in the right OU, but if you need to also provision that user into 10 other on-premises systems, right, that functionality isn't there yet, and that's where MIM would still fit in to handle that.
Got it. You mentioned something that was, I think, really important that seems to be a misunderstanding in the market, which is when I ask companies what their identity source is, they'll say Active Directory.
Right.
And you mentioned taking those identities from the human resources system, from the system of record, and then bringing them into Active Directory. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so ultimately, the authoritative data source for employees is your HR system or systems. A lot of companies will have multiple, but the idea is to push the ownership of that data kind of closer to the end user and the people that are maintaining it. Who knows better what your title should be than the HR system, or who has the most accurate information on who somebody's manager should be. It's the HR system. Who knows when people are getting hired and when people are getting terminated, right? It's all the HR system. So shifting that workload basically to them as the authoritative system, and then making Active Directory essentially a reflection of what's in AD. Same sort of goes for contractors. A lot of larger organizations will have a separate system of record for contractors. Some HR systems like Workday and stuff have components for contingent workers, and it all comes out of one system, which is even better. But treating them exactly like employees, that there is another source of the data, and they have to go through the process and the governance and all that stuff to get into the system, and then Active Directory is simply a reflection of that, where your application is used for authentication.
I've seen a lot of companies, when you mention, is your HR system the definitive source of your employees, they'll say yes, but they'll mention that their contractors or their contingent workers are not part of that. Do you have a suggestion as to how they handle those scenarios?
That is always the discussion on any of them. Just wrapped up a project this week, actually, where they had no real system of record for contractors. So in that case, we leveraged MIM. MIM has its own portal and its own kind of separate directory that most of the time is simply a reflection of the HR and everything else, but it can be the source of authority. So for them, MIM is now the source of authority for their contractors. So we kind of backfilled everybody from Active Directory into there, and now they go through, create an account in MIM, get approval, everything else, then the account gets provisioned, and built in a little bit of governance around those accounts so that they have to be attested to by an employee that, hey, this account for this vendor or contractor or whatever is still needed, and now that account is extended for another 6 months. So they have all these accounts now, they will actually get shut off when they're no longer needed, and closing up all those security holes, whereas before it was just kind of, you got an account and there was nothing to ever shut that account down unless somebody raised their hand and said, you don't need an account anymore, and they go turn it off, which never happens.
Got it. How much of the transition from sort of the on-premise MIM way of doing things to more cloud provisioning approaches, Azure AD, Workday and Azure AD, is a relationship to the applications being in the cloud? If I'm provisioning now a user that exists in Salesforce, or I'm authenticating through the CASB user in Salesforce, or one in another ERP application that happens to live in the cloud sort of scenario right now. Right. How much of that is that transition just representing itself?
A lot of it, I'd say probably 80-90% of it, that's the driver. And I think the other 10-20% is just not wanting to have that extra system on premises with MIM and everything else that goes with it. You can still provision from MIM to something like ServiceNow that has a web service that you can create an account, but why do you want to create all that manually when it's built in natively to Azure AD? And there's a handful of other ones that are using the SCIM protocol where Azure AD can provision directly into that system. Well, I don't have to. Now those are applications I don't have to deal with in MIM. I just need to make sure that your user account and your identity gets to Azure AD.
Yeah.
And then from there, it's handled by that side.
Do you see companies that have ADFS presently, have provisioned Azure AD, having really an end game of being able to drop their own ADFS environment that does that identity relationship, and they manage it all through Azure AD, or is there a need for ADFS?
No, there are some very, very specific use cases where claims rules and stuff in ADFS are required to achieve that aren't fully there yet, but I'd say 95 to 99% of the cases, there's no need for ADFS anymore.
Got it. When you see people who are going through the process of moving to more of a cloud-centric way of provisioning identities, do you see certain mistakes that they're making where, people might intuitively think of doing one thing and they do something else, or there's a best practice that they just simply don't follow and you end up having to correct?
I think the biggest thing is not cleaning up your on-prem AD before you do it. When you put AD Connect in by default, it takes all your OUs and all your users, and it just literally takes everything you've got, good, bad, ugly, and puts it in the cloud. So this example I had of the customer with all these partner accounts and things like that, you're taking all these accounts that have been out there and sort of orphaned for a long time, and now you're putting them out on the internet and exposing them. And if you're not doing MFA or anything on them, right? Now those accounts are weak and internet available. It's just weak and inside. So yeah, I think the biggest thing is just cleaning up what you've got and understanding what you have before you put it up there. And maybe you don't need all of your accounts up there, right? Maybe you don't need to have all the service accounts and things like that up there. And just having a good understanding of what it is you're putting up in the cloud and why.
Got it.
Right.
Now, I know Microsoft just recently GA'd some new capabilities tied to Azure AD. What do you think about those capabilities? What do you think about what's coming next in that ecosystem, particularly the private preview things that are coming down the pipe, provisioning processes, governance? It's going to be kind of a weak spot of Azure AD. How do you feel that they're doing in maturing that?
It's going to be an interesting year or so. There's stuff coming out recently. Azure AD, I'm going to draw a blank on what the name of they're calling the feature, but it's essentially Azure AD Connect, but cloud driven. Okay. So instead of having that server on-prem, now you're configuring that in the cloud, and you just have an agent running in the on-prem world. Two big benefits of that is I don't have an Azure AD Connect server, although I still have to run that agent. But in the M&A scenario or a complex org where you have multi-forest, with AD Connect, you can do that. Obviously, you have to have connectivity into those forests to suck all that data to AD Connect and then ship it up to the cloud. Now with the agents, I don't have to have that. I don't have to have a forest trust. I don't have to have network routing. I don't have to have any of it. I just put an agent on each side and then pull data in from both sides. So in an M&A scenario, you can very quickly get identities from the acquired company into your environment without having to do anything in the on-prem world. So that's one of the big things. And the same sort of concept is happening with MIM, and it's not called MIM, it's probably not going to be called MIM, but you see the same sort of evolution with that, where the logic and the business rules and all that stuff is defined in the cloud, but executed in the on-prem world in an agent. So if I have an HR system that's not Workday or SuccessFactors, whether it's cloud or on-prem, I can still use that as my source of authority, and I can bring those identities into Azure AD, or I can also create them in the on-prem AD or in other on-prem apps. But I'm doing all that through cloud, and the other aspect of that that's planned is the same management agents that you use or connectors that you use with MIM to talk to, like a SQL server or a custom thing that you wrote, or a web services connector to talk to something like SAP. All those connectors, the plan is that those are basically compatible with that agent. So if I have MIM and I've invested in all that stuff and I have all this connectivity, I just want to get rid of the infrastructure side of it and shift that to the cloud, I can still use all of my connectors, so that investment is still valid.
Got it. You mentioned one of the bigger mistakes that companies make when they move to using the cloud provisioning process and using Azure AD is the lack of cleanup on the source side. What are some ways that you recommend companies go through that source cleanup, and what are maybe some of the causes of why they have such a mess?
Well, if you're doing a MIM deployment, a lot of that is sort of inherent, right? You're matching up the accounts on-prem to the data in AD or in HR, and those accounts, when they match up, sort of automatically get updated by that HR data. And then I typically like to kind of flag those accounts as being MIM managed, and now the work is, all right, let's look at all the stuff that's not MIM managed, right, that are sitting in my employee's OU or whatever, and then building processes around looking at those accounts and cleaning that up. The area that's usually not covered in MIM, because we're talking employees and contractors and people, are service accounts, a shared account, like a shared login account for a workstation on an assembly line, like that kind of a thing.
Yep.
Those are the ones that you really need to take separate care of, because they don't really fall under a typical identity management system, because there is no source of authority typically for those accounts.
Got it. When you think about the identity source is the identity source for the use cases that serve it, right? And I feel like there's use cases that serve the workplace productivity scenarios, workstations, and users that access applications and so on. And then there's also use cases that serve end customers of the business. They're not an employee, it's an account that's tied to a customer that's authenticating to an application that we may own or we may be doing business with somebody else. Is there an interrelationship between those two things? Are they usually kept pretty separate? How do you see that picture?
I see both, right? I see a lot of organizations where those consumer accounts or external identities are kept separately, separate Active Directory or separate, other LDAP or something like that. I see a lot where they're in the regular Active Directory, but I see the push to get them out of the on-prem AD, right? I don't want those. I don't want to manage passwords for people that aren't my employees and contractors and all that stuff. And so definitely see a big push to get that stuff out of a system and a directory that organization has to maintain, and leveraging something like a B2B or B2C or something like that, and shifting those identities up there.
That makes a lot of sense. Awesome. So one last question for you. What makes you love doing identity work? We think about hey, there's all this technology in the world. Identity is something that you get up in the morning to go do. What makes that be a space that you enjoy?
Biggest thing for me from a project perspective is no two are the same. So while I'm using the same tool set a lot of times, every scenario is different. It's different combinations of HR applications and on-prem systems that we're creating, or different specific business requirements that they have that other customers don't. So it's taking that same tool set and then kind of applying it differently every time, and kind of pushing the boundaries a little bit of last time I did this, and now I can, take the next step and do that. So that's always been fun for me.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you very much for joining us. Cheers.
Cheers.
And we'll see you next time on Concurrency Beer 30.